you again for joining us today for accessibility legislation in Europe, standards, laws, and how to interpret them. Our speaker today is Susanna Lauren, CEO of Funkanu. Ms. Lauren has a long history of working with disability-related issues at senior management levels. She's a frequent international lecturer and debater and serves on many program committees for conferences on accessibility. At Funka, she takes responsibility for major and international assignments, including for the European Commission. We are delighted to have Susanna with us today. Thank you for doing this webinar, and I will turn things over to you.
Thank you, Kevin. So, welcome everyone again. I am happy that there is an interest for European legislation and standardization. Usually this is not a topic that people love, but it's important and it's a lot of interesting things happening here right now. So we'll try to make this as clear as possible, and please do stop me if I use words or terminology that is strange, because I'm obviously not an English native speaker, so sometimes I invent English words, and if they are not understandable, then please let me know and I will try to find a word that you actually understand. I have, let's see if I can, here. So I have made a little agenda for today, just to make sure that I follow what I said I was going to do. And that I will give just a short background so you know where I'm coming from, and then I will talk a little bit about the procurement directive in Europe, and about the EN standard, the EN 301-549 standard, which goes very closely with the procurement directive. I will also speak about the Web Accessibility Directive, which is maybe more known to most people, and then about the European Accessibility Act, which is a future act that might come, but there's a lot of discussions going on around it, and it's also very interesting, so I think that's worth mentioning as well. And then the European Disability Act, which is something that we all want to see, but it hasn't happened yet, and well, I don't know if it will happen, but I will still mention a bit about it so you know where we are at all these different parts of legislation in Europe in accessibility. And then the Q&A session in the end, as Kevin mentioned. So just a little bit about me and the assignments that I've had, so that you know that I actually know something about what I'm talking about. I was one of the technical experts in what was called the Mandate 376. That is for some reason quite known in the US and Canada. I have realized a mandate is a way that in Europe, when the Commission wants a standard to be a harmonized standard for all European member states, they can mandate the standards organizations to do things. So, well, a mandate means that it's mandatory. So it's not bottom up. It's really decided from the Commission. And this was what happened in 2004. We got a mandate about making a standard for ICT accessibility in procurement. So I have been working with that since the actual work began in 2008 and until I'm still in the technical committee actually. So if you find that standard very hard to read, then you can blame me, at least partly. I also led a monitoring study for the European Commission where we looked at all the monitoring schemes that are happening in the member states today, or until today, in the countries with and without legislation on web accessibility, and we made recommendations for how the new Web Accessibility Directive should be monitored and controlled in Europe. I'm also one of the 7 experts in the WADEX group, and WADEX is Web Accessibility Directive Expert Group. There's a subgroup of these experts that has been assigned to help the member states and the Commission to understand how to make most use of the new legislation under what is called the transposition, which we are under now. I will come back to that. So I'm actually regularly writing about monitoring and just right now preparing for the next meeting with the Commission and the member states. I'm also one of the founders and leaders of what is called the COST network, which is a network of European member state governments that wants to, well, make the Web Accessibility Directive and all accessibility legislation a little bit more for real than some other countries. So we have right now 9 member states in that network, and we work both a little bit officially and unofficially on web accessibility work. And it's very interesting to see how a group of member states can be quite powerful when talking to the Commission. And also, I'm the representative of IAAP in Europe, which I'm very happy to be working with. We haven't been doing so much yet, but to me, it's very important that the IAAP also becomes global in the real sense. And of course, that since I'm based in Europe, Europe is the most important part of this. So the company I'm working for, just very briefly, was founded by the Swedish disability organizations in the mid-90s, and we are now a consultancy. Since the year of 2000, we are a privately owned commercial company. We have our headquarters in Stockholm, Sweden, and we opened another office in Oslo, Norway in 2010. And Norway is interesting because it's outside of the European Union, so it's a completely different market, even if it's just an hour away from here. I'm now in beautiful Stockholm. We also have a Madrid office, which is really our Brussels office, but we choose to have it in Spain instead because the sun shines much nicer there and the wine is better and everything is nicer in Spain. So we have our Brussels office, but we have the staff usually in Madrid. And we're also obviously one of the founders of the IAAP. What we do every day is just normal consulting in accessibility and UX. We have a development department. We do analysis, testing, and advice, recommendations, of course, and a lot of training, just like any other accessibility consultants, I guess. But we also do research and innovation. Around 20% of our turnover comes from non-clients, so to speak. So we do a lot of European research projects and scientific research, as well as more practical testing and things like that. We have a lot of government assignments, of course, and I mean strategic assignments with the policy and legislation, and we do a lot of work that actually affects how the politics of disability topics are moving ahead in Scandinavia and also in other European countries. So we are sitting on all the chairs at the same time, which is kind of interesting. And we do a lot of collaboration projects, of course, with the disability organizations. They are, so to speak, our parents still, even if they don't own us today. But it's extremely important to us to have test persons and really make sure that we are driving the same questions and topics as the user organizations do. So we work extremely closely to the end users in all our assignments. We are, of course, also very much working with standardization. It's an obvious thing. So that's just a little bit of background on who we are and where we come from. Now in Europe, we are really at a crossroads. We are leaving recommendations. We have been living with only recommendations in my part of the world, at least, and going towards legislation. There has been legislation in some countries, but not very strongly enforced. And really, in most countries, there's more of guidelines and wishes than actual rules upon web accessibility. So this is a very interesting time for us. The current situation, which is not only current, but has been like this for the last 10 to 20 years, is that, I mean, all the European countries have ratified the UNCRPD, so that's the basic of baseline for policy work and so on. Finland was very late with ratifying, but they came on board as well last year, so that's good. And there are, of course, many different national discrimination acts, some of them more powerful than others, but they are usually quite old and do not mention much about the web or digital things at all. They are basically for the built environment, more or less. And in some countries, they are more based, more focused towards the workspace, and some are more around democracy and participation in society and so on, and others are more based on education and so on. But none of them really speaks very in detail about web accessibility. There's a lot of policy work going on, of course, and that is maybe more so in the northern part of Europe than the southern part. At least it's more active and used, I would say. but also very soft. There are a lot of accessibility or anti-discrimination things written in the employment laws in many different countries, and some of them are better enforced than others. And some countries also have like a larger companies need to employ persons with disabilities, or they are fined. So that's a different policy working a bit differently in different countries, but most of them have something around disabilities and employment. There are also procurement regulations, and I will come back to that. But only a few countries have actual laws on web accessibility specifically. So this is the world that we have been living in for a long time. And always when I go to the US and talk to people in the accessibility world, I say in Europe, the carrot sometimes can beat the stick. And people just shrug their head and said, no, we don't believe you. That's not happening. How can that be true? But it is true. It has been true for a long time. And it's very interesting to see the cultural differences, I think. The general perception, I think, at least from a US perspective, is that without a law, nothing is happening or very few things are moving. But when you have a law, a lot of things are really happening, and everything, not maybe everything, but much more is moving, and things starts to be better, and people get aware of accessibility issues and so on. And this is also what the end user organizations usually think also in Europe. But in reality, when we have been measuring accessibility, and not only us, but also other research that has been done, we can see that this is only true partly because in some countries without law, they are doing quite well, like Sweden, for example, or Denmark. And in countries where there is just a general law or a very like human rights or anti-discrimination law, like UK and Ireland, they can do very well also when you compare the different statuses of web accessibility in these countries. And then there are some countries like France and Italy where they have a very specific and detailed law, but they are under the average of EU 28 web accessibility when we measure and compare them to each other. So that law equals accessibility, that is not really correct in Europe. At least it hasn't been until now. And then you can ask yourself, how on earth does that happen then? Why is this so? Why is it actually possible to make websites accessible without forcing people with legislation? And I think we need to understand that there's a huge cultural difference between Europe as a whole and the US. We do not sue each other regularly, so there's a completely different mindset. And of course, there's also large differences between the European countries. There's big differences between North and South and between East and West. So I could talk for hours about these cultural differences, but this is not supposed to be that detailed, so I won't do it. But there is a difficulty to talk about Europe as one market sometimes because the differences are much bigger than you can imagine. But the countries that do well without legislation, they have very well implemented policies. These are countries that actually follow recommendations, and you don't need to enforce it. If somebody tells you that this is a good thing and this is what we should do, we are a rich country and we should, of course, communication and information should be for everyone, then at least public sector bodies are doing this. They don't need to be forced to do it. They do it because they understand it's a good thing. And this is actually being made better if the regulations are not too precise, because what we see sometimes is that very, very precise and detailed technical specifications can be outdated or getting people to have the focus in the wrong direction, so to speak. So we actually see that if you have a sort of fluffy or blurred regulation, that is better than to have a too precise one. At least it has been a success factor until now. And then the end user organizations is of course extremely important. They need to know about web accessibility and be knowledgeable. Not all of them are. But also, it works best when they are not too aggressive. When they are smooth and sort of nice and communicative, then that is also a success factor for succeeding in web accessibility. And of course, there needs to be somebody to take care of this. The industry in general, the ICT industry, needs to know about accessibility. Hopefully, not only experts, but also the general industry must know at least something about web accessibility. Otherwise, it doesn't work. But if we have all these pillars, then until now, a very precise law on web accessibility has not been needed to succeed in web accessibility. So that was the first part. Is there any questions so far?
No one has entered any questions, but we can give them maybe 30 more seconds to see if there are any. David is typing. Let's just give him a moment. David asks, how are the European rules named?
Well, I will be talking about 4 different laws in Europe: the discrimination, the procurement directive, the web accessibility directive, the European Accessibility Act, and the European Discrimination Act. And everything will be in the slides, so I hope you will have the possibility to I don't know how this works, Kevin, but I hope that it's also possible for the participants to reach the slides afterwards or to read them. Otherwise, I can send it to you. But it will be in the slides.
Susanna,
the presentation.
Sorry, Susanna.
Go ahead.
I also have a question.
Hi, Pina.
So you mentioned the concerns around if the recommendations or regulations are too specific, it creates barriers. So, as an example, can you tell us what's the language that you guys use in Europe in regards to the level of specificity when you talk about web?
That's a huge question, but what I specifically was thinking about was something we have seen we do a regular status report on web accessibility that is called MEAC, Measuring E-Accessibility in Europe, for the Commission. And in these reports, or the analysis studies that we are doing, we have seen that, for example, in France, that is just one example, where they have been they're basing their legislation on WCAG, but they're actually they have been writing an own standard, so to speak, and then they are really specifying exactly how to do certain things. And that can be very troublesome because the web changes, and sometimes WCAG also changes, and the assistive technology changes. So you need to adapt the standard in the most relevant way. But if the legislation really writes exactly how to do this and that, then that may be obsolete after 6 months or after a couple of years. So that is the problem we have seen when it's too technically or detailed granularity specified. I can give you examples. I can send it to you afterwards if you. I guess you also speak French, so it would be easy for you to understand, I think, if you see it. Also, there are some similar problems in Denmark, but they have been sort of correcting themselves, or they have moved away from being too detailed. I think in the beginning, especially when we had WCAG 1, some countries really specified extremely in detail how to do each part of your website accessible, and that was not a very good idea. We saw that it was very fast being outdated, and also it was very unflexible. If you make a little bit different, you use another kind of navigation system or something, then it doesn't really work. So it's when they go it's when they go beyond the WCAG standard, then it's they should keep to the standard, stick to the standard, and not try to be even more specific than the standard, because then they start creating problems. That's probably the most easy answer to that question.
Thank you.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Does.
We did have one more question come in from Mark Shelton. Will looser regulations make it harder for standardizing best practices and for new technologies to follow/target?
Will looser regulations make it harder for standardization best practices? it's a philosophical question to me, but I don't know. I think what has been working well is when we have like a looser regulation that says you cannot discriminate, but then say please please use WCAG and do not discriminate. Then that is has been until now more effective than saying exactly how to do something. That is really that is what we have found in the studies. But really, I think what we see is that standardizing best practices can be very different in different situations and in different countries. I mean, you need to interpret WCAG in the situation where you are, because the provisions of assistive technology, for example, is completely different. We have in the markets we cover, we have completely different solutions to common problems in accessibility because of the assistive technology that is provided in that country. It differs from the neighboring country. So you need to be the new technologies and new situations or ways to develop things and design things needs to really follow the technological development, I think. So that's why we see this the loose regulations being sometimes more successful, but only if they are also followed by good policy work and competent industry and good end users, and So anyway, that's what we have seen, but that is not what we are going into. We are now moving into a much more regulated world and also much more detailed. So I'll move on. Things are really changing now. We have, the first thing I will talk about is the European Procurement Directive. And I need to maybe explain what a directive is. Directive means legislation on an EU level. So in Europe, the European Commission and Parliament and the Council can decide on a directive, which means legislation on a European level that does trickle down to member state level, and then the directive needs to be transposed into a national law. So when we speak about directive, that means law, but it's a European law that every member state need to implement in their own way, so to speak. So the procurement directive has a lot of interesting news in it, but really I will only talk about the accessibility parts, obviously. So until the end of December 2016, the procurement laws in all member states had a paragraph saying, when possible, the specifications should be decided taking accessibility criteria for persons with disabilities in account. More or less, this is a translation and a little bit simplified from like an average procurement legislation, because the exact terminology can differ from country to country. But it is interesting because the paragraph starts with when possible. So of course nobody thinks it's possible, or it's very easy to go around when you start something with when possible. And then the specifications should be decided. So that is also a very soft regulation. And we have had this regulation in the procurement legislation in European countries for many, many years, but it's extremely rare that we see somebody making accessibility requirements based on this law. They make accessibility requirements if they are aware about accessibility or if they are clever enough to work with it, but very few procurements or call for tenders that we see actually point to this paragraph in the legislation. So it hasn't been very successful, you can say. Also not very known. But from the 1st of January this year, it reads, the same paragraph reads, when the procured is going to be used by humans, which means it's not machine to machine, but the interface should be used by humans, the technical specifications shall be decided, taking all users' needs into account, including persons with disabilities. So the when it is possible is taken away, and now it's every time when the procured thing is going to be used by humans, then the specifications shall take user needs into account, including accessibility. So this is a huge difference. If you're not a lawyer, and I'm not a lawyer, this might seem very like a small change, but it's a very big change indeed. Moving from should to shall is extremely important in procurement legislation. So this, of course, goes for all public sector that needs to procure according to the access procurement laws, which is all public sector, and also some other large organizations and corporations also use the procurement legislation. But at least all public sector bodies need to follow these regulations. Only if the procured item is above the threshold, and the threshold is around $50,000 US. It's 500 and well, it's it is more or less 50,000 US. I don't know who is if people are only from the US listening to this, but in Swedish kroners, there is 528,000 something Swedish kroners, so more or less 50,000 US. Everything under the threshold, then you can do it the way you like, but above the threshold, it needs to follow these requirements. And this is going to be implemented nationally. So again, it's a directive, which means that all member states have been something is happening. Did we lose? Yeah. The captions disappeared. You want me to stop, Kevin, or?
The captionist is working on getting them back, so let's just give her a few minutes or a few seconds here. Captionist, are you ready to go again?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Susanna, we're good to go.
Thanks. So this is now being implemented nationally, which means that the procurement legislation in all member states now have this new paragraph. And this is in effect from the 1st of January 2017. This is a big shift. And it does cover ICT in general. It's not only the web, but ICT in general. And the legislation also points to the EN standard, the EN 301-549, which is the European standard for ICT accessibility requirements in ICT. And I will talk about that later. In this EN standard, there is a chapter 9 which covers the WCAG 00 level 2.0 level AA. So we didn't invent a new web accessibility standard, of course. We took the WCAG standard that most of the world's regulations are already pointing to and just imported it into the EN standard. These are minimum requirements, so all procuring entities and all nations they are welcome to require more, to have sharper recommendations and requirements than this, but this is what you need to do at least when you procure ICT. And to me, this is actually quite fantastic, because I do believe that the enormous purchasing power of public sector in Europe will make a big difference when all public sector procurers are using accessibility requirements in their procurement. This will make a big difference. I'm sure about that. So to me, this is a hallelujah moment when this actually was made into legislation, and we do already see a difference. The legislation is a support for procurers, so now they know what kind of requirements they are supposed to write in their procurement, and it's also not something that you might do or might not do. It's not there's nothing to argue about. You should do it because it's in the law. And one good thing with the procurers is that they are usually lawyers, so when they see a law, they usually follow it. So it's very, I don't mean that they are square, but it's very practical to tell procurers how to do things, because they usually follow the regulations. It also means that we now have equal opportunities for suppliers to match these requirements and to compete on equal terms. So it will make the best offers win, instead of just the ones that can answer very strange or sort of handmade requirements in the most clever way. Now everyone knows what is going on and what is required, and this will be equal opportunities for the industry, which I think also is important. This needs to be known, of course, the legislation and the standard and how to do this needs to be spread. But when procurers understand that public sector really requires accessibility, they will be clever enough to understand that, of course, they want to sell to public sector because of the purchasing power there. And that means that they will have to know, they will have to learn about accessibility to be able to sell to public sector. So they will actually start knowing about this. And we already see this trend. We have been moving from more or less, I don't know, less than 1%, I think, of our clients are ICT suppliers. But so moving from a very, very small percentage, this is really going upwards. We have seen a lot of interest since these new procurement laws have been made public. And we don't only see that in Scandinavia, but also in Holland and Spain and other markets. So it's really, this is already happening. So do we have any questions about the procurement directive?
Just give everyone a few seconds here to see if anyone starts typing. Oh, we may have one.
This is a long question.
Here we go. John Avila asks, could you clarify the dates? I thought it took effect after the national laws, but you mentioned January 17th. What is in effect now before the national laws?
The procurement directive is already transposed. So from the 1st of January 2017, the 1st of January this year, this has already been transposed into national legislation. So in the member state, this is already working. This is also, we had some governments that were a little bit late with this regulation, and it says in the text of the directive that if the national law is not in place timely, then the EU law will start working. So even if there would be a country that I don't know of, somewhere in the Eastern Europe where we don't work that much, if there would be a country that has not yet transposed into national legislation, then the European legislation would start taking effect from the 1st of January 2017 anyway. So 1st of January 2017 is the date for the procurement directive.
Glenda Sims asked, can you share a URL that documents the procurement directive for reference?
Absolutely. I will send that to you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you can send that to me, we'll include that in our follow-up email that we'll send out after the presentation.
Absolutely. I will give you the links to all these laws that I've been speaking about. No problem. So let's move on with the EN standard, the EN 301549, which is called Accessibility Requirements for Procurement of ICT Products and Services in Europe. So this is the standard that the procurement directive points to, but it doesn't say that you need to follow this exact standard, but this is the minimum requirements that are mentioned in the legislation. So if you find another standard or another way to pursue with this minimum requirements, you are welcome to do it. But really, I don't know of any other standards that people would use, but it's important to understand that the standard is not actually written in the law. These are just the minimum requirements. So that's a quite important difference. So what kind of ICT are we talking about here? Well, it's obviously smartphones and desktop computers and ticket machines, whatever sales, what do you call it, vending machines and well, all sorts of ICT. Everything can be ICT these days, but this is just some examples of how much beyond the web we are moving when we talk about the procurement directive and the EN 301/549. Sorry. This is a very broad standard. So there are some built environment requirements. For example, if you have an ATM, it's how to place it, the way to come to the machine. I mean, if you're in a wheelchair, for example, that it should be possible to approach the machine. And then the number 5 of the in the number in the keyboard should be, of course, highlighted in one way or another. And how high or low it should be positioned and everything. So it's a lot of things that are far away from the digital parts of this. It's also like the built environment requirements in there. And of course, also software requirements like text size and text to speech. It's a lot of things about video and things like that. And of course, the WCAG. So there are 13 chapters and they cover many different things, really. So I can understand when people think this is a bit overwhelming, but of course it's extremely important. If I'm supposed to be able to use the ATM, then not only what is on the screen is important, many things around the screen is equally important. So that's just a little bit about the scope of the standard. It also has some biometrics parts and hardware, and I mean it's a huge standard. It's also complex because it combines functional performance statements and technical requirements. So it has got some, I think, relevant criticism for being difficult to understand and difficult to read. But the idea was really to do, or the mandate, the assignment, was really to make something that is so broad and so that covers sort of everything that is important with accessibility in ICT. So this is what we ended up with. It's absolutely not perfect. Like all standards, it's a consensus-based thing. You need to really discuss with a lot of different stakeholders and try to make some kind of compromise. But in my view, it's the best we have, and it's something that has been worked on for a long time. And as I said, it covers many things. So even if it's absolutely not perfect, it's still being worked on, and another version will be hopefully out soon. So there is a bit of help and support out there to help procurers and suppliers to understand the standard. There is a toolkit that was also part of this assignment, the Mandate 376. We developed a toolkit under this in this work, and I know I have been now talking to the US Access Board. That is and others working with the new Section 508 in the US, and they have been looking at this toolkit and are planning to do something similar or updating the tools that are already existing in the US and looking for the European way of doing this for a little bit of inspiration. So I think the idea behind the toolkit is fine, but it's important to know that it is not updated. The toolkit has not been updated since the first version of the standard was released. So please look at the toolkit for inspiration, but do not follow the recommendations of the toolkit, because then you will follow an old standard. So it's another discussion, but I really hope that somebody soon will take care of the toolkit and make it live again, because it's a pity that it's not really maintained. There are a lot of translations already made of the standard into local languages, and I know there are several others on the way, and this is really helpful for many procurers, of course. We have also done some videos in cooperation with Microsoft, so There is a YouTube page for the EN standard with the information videos that are free for anyone to use, and that are hopefully quite helpful. And there is also a lot of training going on. We have been touring I don't know how many countries with training on the standard and how to use it, and also for procurers on how to actually follow the new procurement laws. But there is a huge demand for even more training and so on. So I think we and many others will be doing this for a long time. It's very new for many procurers. But the standard is actually used around the world. I know it's used in Australia and in some countries in South America. So it has been really quite successful, which is nice, of course, for every one of us that have been helping with making it happen. And there's a lot of discussions now on the next update and who will be in charge and so on. So as this was a joint effort between 3 different standardizations bodies, and all these standardization bodies have at least 28 member states in them, there's a lot of democratic things that goes on, and makes it a bit lengthy discussions sometimes, but it will be updated. And also, there's an ongoing discussion between Europe and US about making the EN standard harmonizing with the 508 requirements and so on. So this is a moving target, but it's out there and it's already in use, and hopefully will be even more in use in the future. At least that's what I'm hoping. So any questions about the EN standard? Yes, we have some here.
We did have a couple of come in while you were talking. So Dana Gray asks, which countries have standards or requirements beyond EN 301-549, specifically requirements that exceed WCAG 2.0?
Well, until now, if we talk about the web accessibility requirements, then most of the Scandinavian countries go beyond WCAG, and also Holland goes beyond WCAG until now, at least. But on the other hand, Norway has WCAG, and they have taken out 3 of the success criteria from WCAG. So they have diminished WCAG more than moving beyond it. And if we talk about moving beyond the EN standard, then I cannot give you from the top of my head a really comprehensive, like a comparison among all the countries, because that legislation is covered in, and standards are covered in so many different standards and regulations in different countries. When we talk about ATMs and vending machines and the way to move into the elevator or whatever, that is really very different in many different countries. But moving further than WCAG when it comes to web accessibility, it's at least 5 or 6 countries, Scandinavia and the Netherlands being the most prominent. And I see also
we have another question.
Yeah, the tool I can, yes, it's the mandate. It's under a EU URL for the mandate 376. Will send you the link to the tool. Absolutely, yeah, no problem.
And then Glenda Sims asked, in the U.S., the Air Carrier Access Act specifically requires that airline ICT be accessible. Do airlines in Europe need to be accessible too?
Yes and no. There is no common European legislation for airline ICT. There are requirements for airlines in general in how you do like assistance and guide dogs and things like that. But for the ICT, there has until now not been a specific airline regulation. But there are countries that have specific airline regulations. So that is it's like a big question in Europe as well. But the procurement directive is pointing towards public sector, and the airlines, some of them, the national carriers, they usually voluntarily use the procurement legislations, but they cannot be forced to do it. However, most of the national carriers do work with the web accessibility, and I think they are, in general, fairly good. And then you, of course, have the low-priced airlines, and they don't do anything right.
Okay, that's all the questions. Why don't we continue?
Dana said, so they will no longer be going above WCAG. I don't know, because I think in the procurement legislation, most countries will just follow the minimum requirements, but then there are policy decisions on whether to recommend going further than the requirements. And the next part of my speech is about the Web Accessibility Directive, and there I will come back to what is happening with countries which have been historically recommended going beyond the WCAG and now possibly moving backwards. So that is one of the problems I will mention in the next part. And yes, the link for the mandate, that I'm quite sure that it's the right one. Looks familiar, at least. So I will move on to the directive of the European Parliament and of the Council on the accessibility of public sector bodies' websites. This is the formal name of what is called the Web Accessibility Directive, WAD. Web Accessibility Directive, but the real name is this lengthy. It's a typical EU name, I think. So this legislation has been discussed for a long time and was decided in December last year. And it affects the public sector, of course, in a broad sense, and also organizations that is serving the general interest and funded by tax money. And that is very blurred. And I will come back to that because it's one of the most discussed points in the whole text of the directive. And in the Web Accessibility Directive, we are now under transposition, which means that this is going to be decided by all the member states, how they interpret this serving of general interest. But what is completely clear is that public sector is covered by this legislation, and private sector in general is not covered. It's only what you might call the gray zone. Like we have private hospitals, for example. So they are paid for by the government, but they are run by a private company or a foundation or things like that. So they might be covered, but a real private, like a restaurant or something, will not be affected. So it's basically the private sector. And there is a lot of decision making going on a member state level. So exactly on how to interpret this about the gray zone is really up to all the member states to decide. What is not covered is easier to discuss. Broadcasting is not covered. Usually they are covered by other regulations and laws in the different member states, but they are out of scope of this Web Accessibility Directive. Non-government organizations are also not covered, and the private sector is not covered. So this is what is clearly outside of the scope of the directive. And what is being covered? Well, it's the external website, and then that is very clearly written. In the directive, there's also a mention of intranet, and there's a lot of discussions going on about if that really means only the intranet or if it means all digital internal systems. I do not think that is the objective of this text, but there are people that try to interpret it that way, which is interesting. Also, the extranets are mentioned, but usually that's interpreted like the external website. Documents that are published on the website, and apps. And the app part is maybe the most interesting because that was added very late in the process of legislation. So everyone was very surprised, I think, when we got the decision and apps were in the directive text. That has caused a lot of trouble, but it's extremely interesting and, of course, very appropriate and necessary for end users. This directive is pointing directly to the EN 301549 standard, of which Chapter 9 is WCAG 2.0 level AA. So it's the same thing as with the procurement directive, but here it is much clearer because it is written in the text of the law that this is the requirements that you must comply with. So this is very, very clear and detailed. Again, it's minimum requirements on the EU level, which means that all member states may choose to pose extra requirements or go beyond the EN standard if they want to. There are some exceptions, of course. Archives and old material is not covered, and this is also something that we get loads of questions on. What's an archive? Does that mean everything I had on the website before the law was enforced, or what is really an archive? So that is one of the things that we in the subgroup need to try to define and help the Commission and the member states understanding. Pre-recorded media that was published before the law was enforced will not be covered. Also, live media is not covered, and maps are not covered, but only if there is an alternative to the map. So you need to, if you have like a description on how to find the office or something like that, it needs to be written out in text if there is a map. If the map is not accessible, then you cannot just rely on the map. Then cultural heritage collections like museum things and manuscript are out of the scope of this legislation as well. And user-driven content. So if you have a commentary like a forum, or if you have some way to communicate like a chat function on the website, that is not covered. What the users are actually editing or entering or writing, that is not covered by the legislation, obviously, because the website owner cannot control it. And then if you have some kind of content for closed groups, which is not very common, but there could, of course, be parts of a public sector website or intranet for that sake that are only for closed groups, and then you can choose to have it non-accessible if you have a good reason to it. So how is this actually going to happen? This is going to be implemented nationally, which means that the countries that do have legislation today on web accessibility, they need to rewrite or harmonize their existing legislation to fit with the European Web Accessibility Directive. And the countries that do not have web accessibility legislation, they will need to write a new law. So there's a lot of law making going on in the member states right now. It will also be monitored nationally. So each member state needs to point out an observatory or a monitoring body, a public sector body that will be in control of the control mechanism or the monitoring mechanism. So all the websites that are covered by this will be monitored nationally when the law enters into force. And the European Commission will decide on the method on how this is going to be monitored and how the reporting will be made and so on. And that is one of the things that we are now working very much with in the WADEX group. And I'm also the pen holder for the monitoring part of that task force. So that is what we are discussing very much now. And this is something I think that people are really afraid of, or at least they are not very fond of the idea that the Commission is going to decide on the method on how to monitor nationally. That is not something that is very popular by the national governments until now. So it's a tricky thing to solve. There's also a requirement of an accessibility statement on the website, which is, well, we don't know exactly how that will be designed yet, but that is also one of the things that we are working with in the Web Accessibility Expert Group. And then there needs to be a complaints mechanism so that end users that do not access the content can complain somewhere, and that should be also taken care of in a certain manner. So it should be easy for end users to tell if something is not accessible, and that needs also to be then taken care of in a certain way. And we are now under transposition, which means that the legislation is decided by the Commission since December last year, and now all member states have 21 months to make the legal homework, so to speak, and really either rewrite their legislation or write new laws. And the Web Accessibility Directive expert group, as I have mentioned a couple of times, that consists of course, the European Commission and the member states' representatives, who meet every 2 or 3 months to discuss these transposition questions. And then there are these 7 external experts, where I'm one of them, and they were chosen from, well, it wasn't a procurement, of course, but there are representatives for the end user organizations and for standardization and for different kinds of more or less academic or industry background experts in accessibility. So it's a small group, but we are supposed to make recommendations and help the Commission and the member states representatives to do a good job. And at EU level, when we meet in Luxembourg or Brussels, the topics that are mostly discussed in the transposition that the EU Commission thinks are most important are the monitoring, of course. That is something that needs to be decided on exactly how this is going to be made. The accessibility statement, how is it going to be designed, and is it something you just do freely, or should it be a template, and what should it cover, what should the content be, and so on. And then, of course, the standard on mobile, because now we have a legislation that says that the apps need to be accessible, and then we point to the EN standard. But in the EN standard, there's nothing about apps. It's only WCAG 2.0. And as you know, there is not much about mobile there. And also, how on earth do you monitor an app? I mean, no one has really figured that out yet. So these are the 3 really big topics that we are talking about. And I'm in charge of the monitoring part, and the accessibility statement is made by, or the pen holder for that group is Bart Simmons, who is from the Any Surfer in Belgium, but he's in this particular assignment, he's also representing the whole European Disability Forum, so he's really the end user representative. And we all work together, all 7 experts work on all these topics, but there's one pen holder that is responsible for the content in the recommendations. And then the standard on mobile, obviously, that is W3C, so it's Shadi Abuzara, who is the pen holder for the standard on mobile. But until now, all focus has been on the monitoring, because that is really the most difficult thing we have to solve. And the next meeting is on the 27th of June, and we are supposed to make a new recommendation until then, so that is what I'm mostly doing right now. When we talk with the government in the member states, we are doing assignments also for many of the different member states, and the transposition topics that are discussed at national level are actually something completely different sometimes. In the member states, the work is mostly focusing on who should be covered by the legislation. All these organizations that serve the general interest and are paid for with tax money, but are not really public sector. Where do we draw the line? Who is going to be covered? This is a big discussion in all member states. And again, because of the big cultural differences, this looks completely different in all countries. So it's very, very interesting to see exactly who will be covered in the end. And what content should be covered? I mean, that is not, I mean, what's an archive, for example? That's just one very detailed question, but there's a lot of discussions going on about exactly the content that should be covered. And we get loads of questions about this in all our markets, but no one really knows yet. And this will only be pointed out in detail when the national laws are in place. And should there be requirements beyond the EN 301549 or not? I mean, that is what is being discussed specifically in the countries where we have been moving beyond WCAG until now. So should we keep that, or should we just move backwards again? And we have had some very disturbing and worrying discussions with some governments. I do not think I should say which ones that are actually moving backwards, in my point of view. They are saying, okay, we wanted to move beyond WCAG before, but now when the legislation is like this, why should we be better than our neighboring countries? So they are skipping the requirements that go beyond the EN standard, and now they are sort of pointing just towards the EN standard, which was exactly what we were worried about when this was firstly discussed. So there's a lot of...
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So when you talk about countries moving back or stepping back, you're hearing from countries. What are some of the reasons that they're articulating are pushing them, or to move backwards or to not be as stringent? What are some of the common issues that they're bringing to the table?
Well, usually the member state representatives in the WADEX are most countries have two representatives. They have one legal person, and then they have one policy officer who can be more or less an expert in accessibility or not. It's a bit different, the competences. But what they say usually is that why should we require more than our neighboring countries? The whole idea with the Web Accessibility Directive is to have a harmonized legislation in all Europe, so that we open up the inner market, so that the industry can, the ICT suppliers can, or the accessibility experts can sell their competencies in all countries. So if we, for example, choose to move beyond, then it would be more difficult to get a supplier that can actually fulfill the requirements. That's one of the logics behind it. And also, I think it's just like something you do without really reasoning. I mean, you get a law. It sort of falls onto you from heaven or from Brussels. You are forced into something, and then you try to do as little as possible. I think that is something spontaneously that everyone just they try to pull the brakes as much as they can. And of course they talk about money. I mean, but usually, I mean, at least I know two of the governments that we are discussing with and trying to help and support. They are not basically talking about money, but more the inner market and the harmonization and the not wanting to be doing something else than the neighboring countries. I think that is a more, at least what they openly say. But who knows what is the real reason behind? Maybe it's not the persons that we usually talk to that wants it. It can be a political decision in the background. There's also another country here in Scandinavia where the political situation is now different than it was a couple of years ago, and they have moved from really wanting to do this to being very reluctant to do it. So it's also a question about left and right in politics, I think, sometimes. So interesting question, though. Thank you. So I need to move on. This legislation is going to enter into force stepwise. So in September in 2018, it says 2108, that's wrong. It should be 2018, I'm sorry. September 23rd next year, new interfaces must be, websites and internets must be must comply with the legislation. And then that is when it actually enters into force. And then 1 year after, the 23rd of September 2019, then the existing websites and interfaces need to comply with the new legislation. So if you do something new or a new redesign or an update, then you need to make it happen already next year. But if you have something very old, an old system, then you get another year to make sure that that old system actually also complies to the regulation. And then with perfect European Commission logic, it's not another year, but June of 23rd in 2020, the apps need to be accessible. So it's firstly, it's 12 months, and then it's just 12 months, 24 months, and 33 months. Very clever. But you have longer time for your apps, and that is of course very good, because now we don't have the standard to comply with already. So I think that is a clever thing. Do we have any further questions? around the Web Accessibility Directive?
We don't have any in the chat yet, and I don't see anyone typing, so why don't we press on in the interest of time?
Yeah, actually someone is typing, but or not. So I'll move on.
What about old PDF files?
Yes, PDF files are covered. PDFs are documents, so they are covered. And if they are, if the PDF was published before the 23rd of September 2018, they are okay until you have another year. So in 2019, in September, the old PDF needs to be accessible, which is a huge question, of course. And then that's a very good question, because that also really points to the question, what is an archive? So it could be interpreted like, if I put my old PDFs in an archive, then they are not covered, right? So that is one of the things we really need to figure out, how to draw the line there, because between what is an existing PDF, like an old one, and really an archived PDF. I cannot tell you what is really the right legal interpretation of that, but that is one of the things we need to find out. Very good question, thank you. So just the last short part is what is proposed but not yet decided. And I talk about this because this is something I know is very much in discussion worldwide. We are going to talk about this in the UN, and this is really in discussion in many countries, and also in US, I know. So just to make sure that you don't mix things up, I will also mention the European Accessibility Act. This is not yet decided. This is only a proposal, and the proposal was published in December 2015, but there is no decision made yet. And this act or law is covering public sector, products and services. So this, if it comes true, will be a very broad legislation and covering much more than only public sector. So it's very much it's pushed by the end user organizations, obviously, but I do not think that the way it is written right now, it will be pushed through. I have difficulties seeing that. There are many problematic things in the way the proposal is written. But I do think that sooner or later we will have something similar to the European Accessibility Act, but it will not happen in the upcoming 1 or 2 years. It will take some time. That is my best guess from what I'm hearing from the Commission. But a lot of discussions going on and many conferences, and you can see many forums and dialogues around this, and we get also loads of questions about the Accessibility Act. So very interesting indeed, and specifically, of course, about the larger coverage of private sector. Then the European Discrimination Act. This is a sad thing, always makes me feel bad, but this Discrimination Act is really closely related to the US Anti-Discrimination Act, the ADA. But it was stopped by Germany in 2008, and it has not been, it sort of put in the freezer in 2008, and it has not been moving since then. It's a human rights legislation, that's the proposal at least, and of course this is something that not only the end user organizations, but many other also really would like to see happening. But I haven't seen this moving since, it has been a long time since anyone tried to push this through. So I think what will happen is that the European Accessibility Act, in one version or the other, will actually happen, and then let's see what happens with the European Discrimination Act. And then, of course, there are also things moving in the national legislation in many markets. We see sharpening or strengthened discrimination acts on a national level, and these are also sometimes connected into broadcasting and into education and things like that. So there's a lot of really interesting things happening in many of the different member states, but I don't have the time to go through all of them. But if you have some specific questions about one specific country, I will be happy to answer that offline later on, or send me an email. So just to wrap this up quickly, if we are lucky, in a perfect world, hopefully this is what will happen. The procurers will set requirements for procurement, which will really make a difference because the suppliers will then need to meet the requirements, which means that they need to understand accessibility and try to do the right thing. And because of the Web Accessibility Directive, the website owners will be controlled and monitored. And in many countries in Europe, we have a very clear name and shame culture. So nobody wants to be in the bottom end of that list and have the shame of being non-accessible. So hopefully that will help. And if that is not enough, we will also have the complaints mechanism. So the end users will also help by having a real way, a tool to make their voices heard. So all of this will hopefully mean that the world will become a much more accessible place. Hopefully this is at least what will happen if legislation really helps. But we are not entirely happy, and Funka is not the only consultancy that is a bit worried. We have many colleagues in the industry that say the same thing, because we see in the countries where we have had legislation, and also in parts of accessibility, like in the built environment, for example, we have been we do have legislation, and there is very obvious risks there that legislation becomes the goal and not the tool. And this is really what we see happening in quite many places. And also to us, being in a part of the world where WCAG is only the baseline, I mean, when we do accessibility audits, we have, I think WCAG is 15 or 20% of the success criteria we check for. And so for us, the legislation is really pointing, not maybe backwards, but at least just pointing to very small portions of what we consider is real accessibility. So this is also a bit difficult to us. And we see successful clients really basing their work on quality and not on legislation. We don't believe in forcing people to do the right thing. Because we can also see a little bit of attitude differences between what we have to do or trying to do something good. And that is where we see the differences, for example, in the built environment, where most of our markets have already very detailed requirements and regulations. And the assignments we get is actually what do we have to do not to go to jail or not to be fined or something. But in the markets where we have no real accessibility legislation on web accessibility, then the clients are more interested in how to do something good, which is, of course, much more encouraging and much more fun for us to work with, but also makes it much better for the end user. So the reason we are a bit skeptical to all of this is that fear doesn't foster innovation, at least not in our minds. So we hope that the legislation will be successful, but we still think that a lot of other work needs to be done. And I think Steve Jobs says this very cleverly, because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. I think that goes for all of the accessibility experts in the world that help us in making this happen. So I'm already over time, so I will stop there. Thank you. Do we have any more questions?
I have one more, if nobody does.
There's one question in the chat, which is, where is a good resource for finding more information on the strengthening of education standards? Well, the problem is I don't have very much links to English material, but if you trust Google Translate with translations, I can send you some examples. We have, for example, a very interesting vote now in the Parliament of Norway, where their Discrimination and Accessibility Act is, the proposal is to cover also the educational system, which then will cover learning management systems and learning material and so on, which is really interesting. So I'll be happy to share that with you, but these will be in local languages, unfortunately. So Pina, what was your question?
Susanna, you mentioned before, you know, that you're working with all the different states in the UN, in Europe as well as U.S. and as part of the UN board that you are on. How much of other countries or other places like, let's say, Australia, Asia, how much of that is influencing, if anything at all, what you guys are doing?
You mean in terms of what is happening in Europe, or what is happening in Funka in Europe?
In Asia or in
I don't.
for example, how does that compare? Like, any thoughts? I mean, it could be a lengthy discussion, but just briefly, any thoughts on what you're seeing outside of Europe?
Well, I think there's two things in your question. One is what is happening outside of Europe that is actually affecting Europe. And I think from the Commission point of view and also the standardization bodies, the only place they look is the US. I mean, that's the only thing that has been in the mandate and in the work that we have been doing when we measure web accessibility, we always measure EU 28 plus US, Canada, Australia, and Norway. So that is what we do, but like Africa or Asia, South America is never covered. So I think Europe, the legal parts of the Parliament and the Council and the Commission, they are, if anything, they are looking towards the US. And that is usually because they believe that the ICT industry is strong in the US, so we should harmonize our standards and so on. So they talk about the inner market, but they also want to make it possible, of course, for the US companies to enter the inner market and to work in a good way. So I don't think on a political level that what is happening in other parts of the world is really affecting Europe in such a way that you would maybe hope or desire, which would be good for Europe, I think. But to my knowledge, they do not really look to other places than the US. But if you ask me what is affecting us who work with this, and I mean, loads of things are happening in the same time. And I mean, we have been doing things in South America, which is extremely interesting, and a lot of policy work is going on there. And also we work closely with both Australia and New Zealand. And both these markets are extremely interesting also, and things are happening. We are not doing that much work in Asia, but we have been in Iraq, for example, which is also an interesting market. So especially in procurement, I would say a lot of things are moving ahead now. And from the end user organization perspective, I know they are really, the European Disability Forum and also the International Disability Association are working closely with us and many other organizations to try to share knowledge and move ahead together with accessibility. And I know the EN standard is being used widely, and we have also just made translations of the captions. So we now have the captions in many local languages, including Spanish, which is basically for the Mexican market, and also Portuguese for the Brazilian market, because we also do some policy work there. So I would say still US and Canada is leading the way, and Europe is trying to catch up when it comes to legislation. Norway might be the most interesting place to look for inspiration, because they are doing things completely differently, and they also have a much broader perspective. They talk about much more about universal design than only accessibility. So that would be my inspiration. But I also want to stress that we do not know all other countries in the world. We are covering Europe well, but there might be loads of things happening in Asia that I don't know of.
Thank you.
Susanna, we also had a question come in from Talia. Does the legislation advance the employment of people with disabilities?
Not directly, no. But of course, when the procurement directive, if and when the result of the procurement directive is that all ICT that is procured is also accessible, that will mean that a person with a disability will also be able to work at that office or that organization that have procured accessible systems. Because one of the barriers for persons with disabilities to work today is actually that the digital systems are not accessible. So that will, of course, affect employment. But there is, in the accessibility legislations that I have been talking about today that are enforced and decided, none of them actually mention employment of people with disabilities. So that is usually covered in either employment legislation or in discrimination legislation, which are always on a national level.
And then we have another question from John. EN 301 549 seems to have some regular small updates and possibly more to harmonize with Section 508. How are the updates accepted or required for national laws that were already written?
Yeah, very interesting question. That is a it's a huge problem. The Web Accessibility Directive is pointing towards the EN standard of the version 2.1. So that needs the ETSI standardization body to confirm a stable standard when the update is made or the harmonization with 508 is made. And then it needs to be going through a very sort of detailed, written out process of how this is being implemented. So it will take years, I'm sure. In the procurement directive, it's much easier because there it's not written directly in the legislation. It just says that it just points to the standard. So that will go faster. So we risk having a position or a situation in a couple of years where the procurement directive is pointing towards a later version of the standard than the Web Accessibility Directive. I hope that clever people in decision-making positions will understand that this is stupid and try to do something of it. But the EN standard is owned, so to speak, from all the three standardizations bodies, SENS and SENELEC and ETSI together. And that is one of the problems with this standard, that it's very hard to make a democratic process around the whole thing. But I'm sure it will take time before a new version of the standard gets so stable and harmonized so that it will also be covered in the legislation.
We do have a few more minutes for questions, so if there's any more, feel free to unmute yourself and ask or type it in the chat box. Well, I am not hearing anyone or seeing anyone typing. So, Susanna, thank you for this presentation. It was very informative, and I'm sure our guests appreciated it as well. And a special thank you to the captionist, especially getting everything going with those few little bugs at the beginning there. So thank you very much to both of you. We do have a feedback survey available. So for those of you using Adobe Connect, you can go ahead and click that link listed under the fill out the survey. So we always appreciate hearing what you think. And for those of you that have joined us for some of the previous webinars this season, if you'd like to complete it multiple times and give us some feedback on the other webinars that you've attended, we appreciate that as well. We do have a number of upcoming webinars scheduled as well. Our next webinar will be held on Tuesday, June 27th, and that is titled, Where is Your Organization on the Accessibility Maturity Scale? And then we have another webinar coming up on Thursday, July 27th, called Tools for Automating the Captioning of Video. So we would love to see all of you at those as well. We will be sending out an email with the survey feedback link as well to those of you who are not connected to Adobe. Please go to our website, accessibilityassociation.org, to see the full list of webinars in the 2017 series. We do have some great presentations coming up. That concludes our webinar. So once again, a big thank you to Susanna and our captionist. To exit the webinar, you don't have to do anything special. You can just go ahead and close Adobe Connect or your browser window, however you are connected to the session, and it will log you out. So thank you, and we hope to see you next time.